Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Mon Carnet de Poche. I'm Steven. I am a history fanatic. I love reading books, data, research papers, anything to do with history where I can learn and gain a new insight on anything to do with history. Thank you for taking the time to join me today on this little video series. If you've been following me, you've realized now that I've been talking a lot about different subjects regarding colonial Mexico City society, from the social networks people constructed to survive, to the sistema de castas, and just the general network series that the Spanish attempted to set up. However, in all these videos, you've probably noticed that race was never as simple as the elite wanted it to be. And actually, in today's episode, I'm going to be diving deeper into this very issue by focusing on the everyday people of Mexico City, the plebes, and how they navigated the fluid and often very confusing world of race. For the elite, race was supposed to be a very clear, fixed identity that tied both your ancestry and your place in society. But for plebes, things weren't nearly as straightforward. Race could be flexible, something that changed depending on your social connections, your behaviors, and even how others perceived you. So, how did race work in practice for the urban poor in Mexico City? And I think that's a very important question to keep in mind as we go about this video. Additionally, I just want to mention that I'll be referencing the work of Dr. Robert Cope and his more famous book, The Limits of Racial Domination, Plebeian Society in Colonial Mexico City, 1660 and 1720. So, for this first section, we'll be going over the inconsistencies of racial labels. And to begin with, we might generally think that official documents like baptisms, marriage, and burial records would give us clear answers about a person's race. But that's where things get complicated. You see, priests and officials often had to rely on what individuals or their families said about their race. As you can imagine, this led to some inconsistencies. They didn't have the benefits we have of now being able to have constant records at hand for them to be able to reference back to a person's claim. That would be nice, but they just didn't have it. And a great example of this is actually a unique case that Dr. Cope points out in his book, that of Domingo Velázquez. And Domingo was a young man who had discovered that his baptismal records mistakenly listed him as a casta, meaning he was categorized as having mixed ancestry. And this was a very serious problem for him, because being labeled as a casta came with certain social limitations. So, what did Domingo do? I'd like to think that he quickly gathered witnesses to prove that he was actually of Spanish descent, because that's actually what he did. He gathered witnesses, and we have that document that says so. And Domingo's case shows us how plebeians could contest racial labels, especially when these labels didn't align with their social aspirations or how they saw themselves. Parish records like Domingo's baptismal certificate were often arenas for these kinds of disputes. And as Dr. Cope actually explains, let me read it for you. Quote, "Parish books should not be viewed as neutral or objective records, but as one forum among many for the contestation and manipulation of racial identity," close quote. In other words, these records weren't set in stone. They could be influenced, challenged, and even changed depending on the circumstances. This flexibility in how race was recorded wasn't just limited to baptismal records. Marriage and burial records also showed the same inconsistencies. For instance, a person might be labeled as mestizo in their marriage record, but as Spanish in their burial record. And this actually tells us that race was never a fixed identity in colonial Mexico. It definitely shifted over time, and plebes often had a hand in shaping those records. And it wasn't just about changing labels to gain social status. Sometimes it was about protecting protecting one's reputation or avoiding the limitations that came with certain racial categories. And as we've seen, the recording of race in official documents was a process that could be negotiated, especially for plebes who understood how to work the system per se. And this is just one way plebes navigated the complexities of race in colonial Mexico City, whether through bribes or through the peer pressure towards priests by their neighbors. They managed to get these changes done. In this next section, I'll be looking at another key aspect of race relations, which is how marriage can influence a person's racial status and how plebes used marriage to cross or reinforce racial boundaries. So, this section is called Race and Marriage in Plebeian Society. Marriage in colonial Mexico City wasn't just about love as much as we'd love it to be. It was also a key way to navigate social and racial boundaries. For the plebes, marriage could reinforce racial divisions or in some cases help a person move up in social hierarchy. In plebe society, marriage often followed patterns of endogamy, which means people tend to marry within their own racial groups. For example, Spanish would generally marry other Spaniards, while mestizos married mestizos. But this wasn't a hard and fast rule, especially among the urban poor. Interracial marriages were not uncommon. These unions could have a big impact on how people were perceived racially. One of the reasons people tended to marry within their racial group was to preserve their social status. And as Dr. Cope actually points out, quote, all groups except castizos and black males have endogamy rates of over 50%. Spaniards showed the most marked propensity for in-group marriages. So in other words, marrying within your racial group was a way to maintain privileges. But there were many exceptions to this rule. Interracial marriage occurred frequently and among plebes, and these unions could blur the racial boundaries that the Sistema de Casta tried to reinforce. For example, a mestizo man marrying an indigenous woman might be classified as mestizo, but their children could be labeled differently depending on their social context. In many cases, actually, marriage wasn't just a personal decision. It was also a strategic one. Plebes often use marriage as an excuse or a form to improve their social standing or even change their racial classification. For example, a mestizo who married a Spanish woman might claim to be more Spanish than mestizo, and over time, their children could be classified as castizo or even Spanish. And this actually brings us back to the idea that race wasn't just about biology or appearance, it was about how you fit into society, and marriage was one way to reshape that identity. And as Dr. Cope explains in his book, marriage could influence not only a person's social standing, but also their racial identity, as spouses often passed into their partner's racial group. And, close quote, whether this was, up or down, that's how it happened. However, it's also important to know that this wasn't always a straightforward process. While marriage could open doors to new social opportunities, it also reinforced racial divisions in many ways. People who married outside their racial group often faced social scrutiny, and their racial identities could be contested depending on how they were perceived by others. So, while marriage was a powerful tool for navigating the racial hierarchy, it was also a double-edged sword. Plebes used it to cross boundaries, but they were also limited by the social and racial expectations of their time. Marriage was just one of the many ways race was negotiated in colonial Mexico City. And so, and we'll actually go into the complications that this rigid racial system of the castas had on people, because mixed race unions were common, and you'll see they made it harder for the elite to maintain their strict definitions of race. And so in this section of miscegenation and the limits of the Sistema de Casta, we'll get into it. While marriage played a key role in shaping race in plebeian society, there was another reality that the Spanish elite tried to control by doing all that they could, but they couldn't fully contain miscegenation, which is mixed race unions. And these mixed race unions were widespread, and they posed a direct challenge to the rigid racial categories of all the Sistema de Castas. The Sistema de Casta was built on the idea that race could be clearly defined based on a person's ancestry. But in practice, the boundaries between racial groups were constantly being blurred. Miscegenation, both within and outside of marriage, complicated these neat divisions that the Spanish set up. As plebes formed families across racial lines, new identities emerged that didn't fit neatly into the elite's categories. One of the clearest examples of this is how certain racial categories like mestizo and mulatos began to dominate the social landscape, while others like castizo and morisco faded into the background. But by the late 17th century, mestizos and mulattos made up a significant portion of the population, while more specific racial categories didn't really gain as much traction. But why did some racial categories stick while others faded? Part of the reason is that the broader categories like mestizo and mulatto reflected the social and cultural blending that was happening among the plebeians. These terms became more useful because they covered a wide range of people who didn't fit into these specific boxes of the elite caste system. And while these terms reflected the reality of life in colonial Mexico City, they also showed the limits of the Sistema de Castas. The Spanish elite wanted to control race through rigid labels, but miscegenation made this nearly impossible. People from different racial groups were forming families, building communities, and blending cultures in ways that defined easy categorization. And this blending wasn't just happening in plebeian neighborhoods. Mixed race unions were also common among people who moved between different social classes and racial identities. As Dr. Cope notes, miscegenation was not confined to the lower orders, but was present even among families that sought to maintain their Spanish identity. Close quote. So, while miscegenation made it hard to maintain clear racial divisions, it didn't erase the social hierarchy completely. The elite still tried to enforce their ideas of racial purity, and plebes often faced social pressure to conform to these expectations. However, the reality on the ground was much more fluid, and the boundaries between racial groups continued to blur. So, while the Sistema de Castas might have looked rigid on paper, miscegenation constantly tested its limits. As more and more plebes formed families across racial lines, the elite's attempt to control race became harder to enforce. And I sometimes when I look at this topic, it kind of hits me personally because being a minority in the United States and being in an interracial marriage and living in a very conservative state, sometimes it does feel like the existence of myself and my potential future children don't fit neatly with the political push that some conservatives might have here in the United States. And I'm sure maybe a lot of people might feel that, but it's important to note that this isn't a new topic and people have survived and dealt with this. And so anyways, in this next section, I will be looking at how some plebes took this even further, using the idea of passing to cross racial boundaries, change their identity over time. So this next section is called Passing and Racial Variability. As we've seen, race in colonial Mexico City was anything but rigid. For the plebes, racial identity wasn't just something you were born with. It was something you could change over the course of your life, per se. One of the ways this happened was through the practice of passing, which means where a person could adopt a new racial identity, often to improve their social standing. Passing wasn't always a deliberate act either, but it happened as plebes navigated the social complexities of colonial society. A person's racial identity could shift depending on who they married, where they worked, or how they presented themselves in public, and over time, they could cross into a different racial category. One of the tools historians use to track this phenomenon is called nominal record linkage, which is the process of connecting records from different stages of a person's life, like marriage and burial certificates, to show how their racial identity changed. Dr. Cope explains that better than 1 in 6 persons recorded here changed their racial status during their adult post-wedding lifetime, close quote. And he was referencing the census and various records he had on him at the time, which essentially it meant that more than 16% of the people he studied at that time changed their racial identity as adults, often after marriage. This wasn't just a small anomaly, it was a common part of life for plebes in colonial Mexico City. Race was never really set in stone back then. It could evolve depending on a person's circumstances. Passing into a different racial category wasn't just about social mobility, it was also about survival. And for most plebes, adopting a new racial identity could help them escape the restrictions that came with being classified as indigenous, black, or mestizo, which are not bad labels, just that the Spanish, unfortunately, were pretty racist. But I'm just saying, if you identify as indigenous, black, or mestizo nowadays, it shouldn't be a restriction, but then it was. Anyways, by passing as Spanish or castizos, they could access better jobs, more opportunities, and higher social status. But passing wasn't always a smooth process. Many people who attempted to cross racial lines often faced skepticism and social pressure. For example, if a mestizo tried to pass as Spanish, their neighbors or community members might challenge their new identity. As Dr. Cope points out, plebes were often subject to public scrutiny when they attempted to shift their racial identities, especially if it appeared to contradict social norms, close quote. For plebes who successfully did pass, it wasn't just about how they looked, it was about how they behaved and who they associated with. If they adopted Spanish customs, spoke the language fluently, and distanced themselves from indigenous or African practices, they were more likely to be accepted into higher racial categories. But passing could also be temporary. A person's racial identity could shift back and forth depending on the context, and in some cases, they might be seen as Spanish, while in others, they could be reclassified as mestizo or muleto. This fluidity shows how plebes had to constantly navigate and renegotiate their racial identities. Passing wasn't just about ambition, it was about adapting to a system that tried to lock people into rigid racial categories. But, as we've seen, plebes constantly pushed back against those limits, using the fluidity of race to improve their circumstances. And in this next section, I'll actually explore how social networks played a key role in shaping racial identity. And so this section is called Social Networks and the Redefinition of Race. Race wasn't just about what you looked like or how or who your parents were. It was about who you knew and how you fit into your community and the social networks you built. For plebes in colonial Mexico City, race was often a reflection of these social relationships. In plebeian society, people from different racial groups worked together, lived side by side, and formed close-knit communities. As a result, your racial identity could be influenced by the company you kept. For many plebes, their social network, or the people they interacted with on a daily basis, played a huge role in defining how others saw them racially. Dr. Cope describes this dynamic by saying, quote, "A person's race might be described as a shorthand summation of his social network," close quote. So in other words, race was not just about ancestry, but about who you were connected to and how you were perceived within your community. And this is especially clear when we look at the relationship between different racial groups. For example, mestizos and indigenous people often had strong social and economic ties. These connections shaped how people from both groups were perceived, creating a kind of shared identity. Dr. Cope explains that mestizos maintained close ties with Indians, both socially and economically, close quote. In the same way, muletos and mestizos also formed close-knit communities. These groups often intermarried, worked in similar trades, and lived in the same neighborhoods. And over time, their identities became linked. And it was very common for people to move fluidly between these racial categories based on their social networks. For plebes, race wasn't something that could easily be separated from the social realities of daily life. Your relationships, who you worked with, who you married, and who your friends were, helped define your place in the racial hierarchy. This also meant that race could be redefined over time. As plebes built stronger social ties with people from different racial backgrounds, their own racial identity could shift. Someone who started out as a mestizo might be reclassified as Spanish if they formed the right social connections. In many ways, social networks allowed plebes to rewrite the rules of the sistema de castas. While the elite tried to impose a rigid racial hierarchy, plebes simply used the relationships to create more fluid and flexible identities. And race wasn't something that was set in stone, as mentioned before. It was shaped by how people lived and worked together. So, this social fluidity shows us that plebes weren't passive participants in the colonial racial system. They actively shaped and redefined race through their everyday interactions, even though maybe that's not how they saw it at the time. And actually, in this next section, as I begin to wrap up, I want us to look at the long-term impact of these flexible racial identities and how plebes experiences challenged the elite's control over the caste system. So, conclusion and aftermath. Alrighty, guys, we've made it to the end of the lecture, I guess we could say, and I want us to kind of think. So, what does all of this tell us about race in colonial Mexico City? We've seen that for plebes, racial identity wasn't rigid or fixed. It wasn't just something you were born into. It was something you could actually negotiate, adapt, and even change over time. Through marriage, social networks, and even passing, plebes found ways to navigate and sometimes subvert the rigid racial categories imposed by the Spanish elite. The sistema de castas may have tried to enforce a strict racial hierarchy, but in practice, race was fluid, constantly being shaped by the realities of daily life. For plebes, race was more than just ancestry. It was about behavior, reputation, and social connections. It was something that could change as people moved through different stages of life, built new relationships, and engaged with their community. As Dr. Cope tells us, the urban poor rejected the elite's notion of a racial hierarchy. Plebes demonstrated their creativity by redefining race in a way that made sense to them and served their purposes, close quote. So, this fluidity wasn't just a loophole in the system. It was a rejection and a reflection of how plebes survived in colonial Mexico City. By blending social and racial identities, plebes pushed back against the idea that race was a strict, unchangeable marker of status. But what about today? In modern times, we often think of race as something more fixed and as a biological or cultural marker that defines who we are. But isn't it still influenced by our social interactions, our networks, and the way others perceive us? How much of our racial identity is determined by society, and how much control do we actually have over it? Can we truly say that race is just about biology, or do we still see traces of this social fluidity in the way people identify today? I don't know about y'all, but sometimes when that census question pops up or asks me about my race, I sometimes struggle. And what about the social pressures that come with racial identity? Just like plebeians faced scrutiny when they try to cross racial boundaries, we see people today grappling with societal expectations around race. How do these expectations shape our opportunities, our behavior, and our sense of self? And are we truly free from the rigid hierarchies of the past, or do we still navigate a system that categorizes and limits us based on race? And please leave your comments on this topic, because I'm very interested in knowing, and I think it's a conversation we all ought to have and ponder upon. But anyways, thank you for joining me into this deep dive into plebeian race relations in colonial Mexico City. If you found this episode interesting, please don't forget to subscribe and leave your thoughts in the comments below. In our next episode, I'll be diving into other topics of colonial Mexico City, and hopefully that'll come out here in a couple of days. But in the meantime, feel free to go back and review some of the other videos. But yeah, anyways, thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful time. See you next time on Mon Carnet de Poche. Bye.